watching NotesIn9.
Hello, and welcome to NotesIn9. I'm David Leedy. Episode 106, Introduction to Java Controller Classes. And really, who doesn't like control? Okay, before we get started on the show, some additional NotesIn9 resources. My main site is NotesIn9.com. I currently run an index site, which is pretty bad, but I'm actually starting to make some baby steps progress into fixing it. And then there's the cheat sheet site at cheatsheet.notesin9.com. In the community, we've got XPages.info and OpenNTF as the key sites. We've got news at Collaboration Today. And again, I forgot to update the slide, but there's closing in on 1,300 questions asked and answered on Stack Overflow. And the XPages forum seems to be getting a little busier with some more discussion going on over there. So if you have any problems or you need help, you do have resources to go, and there's people usually willing to try and help you. Just when you ask a question, be detailed, be succinct. Strip out anything that really isn't needed if you post code and examples or something like that, and be polite, I guess, and your chances are fairly good of getting help if someone is able to help you, which doesn't mean that you couldn't be doing something that no one's ever tried before, because that does happen too. So, okay, so don't be shy. Okay, just a couple little bits of NotesIn9 news. I'm gearing up for this XPages Mobile Madness event, which, again, event might be too big a word because I've got some videos and some interest. I don't have a lot going on yet, so if you're interested in contributing to NotesIn9, I'd sure be interested in talking to you. I'm looking for anything mobile related. I know I've done a lot of mobile lately. Some of it has been rather painful. Some of it is kind of nice. And I'm going to have some stuff of my own. But it's not just mobile controls that comes out of the box. You know, if you're working with jQuery or Bootstrap or Kendo UI and you're targeting a phone or a tablet or anything mobile, or especially AppCelery. I'd love to see AppCelery stuff myself. Or you have a tip on how to debug because you can't always do a view source and things like that, you know, or just you've got some cool CSS or meta tags, you know, or something like that. Let me know. I'd love to talk to you about getting you on the show. Hopefully, I'll have a video or two starting around the 15th, if all goes well. So that's the plan. Okay, so thanks. Now, in the biggest news of the Lotus community, NotesIn9 Yellowverse today is this. Kathy Brown actually submitted a video to me for the Mobile Madness event. So this is, I mentioned her, I think, on the last show or the show before that, and this is proof positive that public shaming works. So be afraid. If I know your name and I've talked to you before, you have yet to submit a video to me. Be afraid, Paul Withers. So anyway, let's move on. I've got a great new contributor today that I'm excited to be on, and he's a great guy. I met him at I believe it was MW Lug. His name is Jesse Gallagher, and he's got his blog is at frostilic.us. And he's got this, I think it's a fairly new consulting company called iknowsomeguys.com. So if you need help, if you need mentoring, if you need anything, I'm sure he is capable of supporting you and working with you. He's on Twitter at Gidgerby, and I have no idea what that means, and I'm kind of afraid to ask. But again, he's a great guy, and he's actually one of the key guys behind this new OpenNTF API initiative. And if you haven't seen what that or heard what that is, that's something that him and I'm not going to throw out too many other names because I'm going to miss some of them, because there's a core group of people working on this project. It's a project to basically make a new Java API, I think, for like all the Lotus Domino backend classes, but they're trying to write it better. So they're going to build in recycling events for us, and they're going to, rather than having to, I guess, use iterators, we can like walk through a view kind of like for all. You know, like a for all loop or for each loop or whatever you call it. So some nicer ways to walk through views and some things. So if you're worried about Java, if you're scared about it, what this, I believe what the intent of this is to just make to modernize the Lotus Domino API so it's easier to digest, especially coming from Lotusscript background or even a pure Java background, where you've got all these shortcuts now and they don't exist out of the box. So that is certainly a project worth looking at, and there's a lot of people blogging about that because it can speed up your coding. So again, he's a key guy for there, and you want to pay attention to that. Okay, so what he's going to talk about today is Java, and I've talked about Java a little bit, and there's a lot more Java coming. And again, I've mentioned before in the What is Java show, I think that Java is not something to be afraid of. But what he's going to do today is he's going to go over this concept of a controller class, and that's a little new to me. Like when I do Java and when I did Lotusscript custom classes, I'm really good at working with objects that are based on business objects. Okay, so like a customer object or a scanner object or a contact object or a company object, whatever, something that makes sense. But he's going to he's going to kind of demonstrate using an object to control an actual XPage. So it's a little more esoteric to me, but still very powerful. So he's going to show you kind of how to put all your core code into this Java object to control, making multiple rows in a table, things like that. So it's very interesting stuff and very powerful. What that leaves you with is a very clean XPage. It's almost just like markup, and I believe he says in the video at some point, it's like, how you separate HTML and CSS and JavaScript. This is the same thing. You have your XML markup, and now you're separating out your core logic into one place, this one Java controller class, or maybe backing beans, another word for it. I don't really know that, but so this is kind of a little more on the advanced side, a little bit, but I think it's a really good overview of just what's possible to do it. So I would suggest, if you're new to Java going into this, or so, don't worry about all the syntax or so. Just try to worry about the concepts of separating out this back-end logic to control your page into one spot and leaving yourself with a much cleaner XML representation of your XPage, because that's a really nice thing going forward. Okay, so I talked way too much, so with that being said, let's go to the demo, and here's Jesse.
Hi there. There's been a lot of great discussion about Java and server JavaScript in the community lately, initially from a post by Tim Tripkiny over on his blog about server JavaScript being a crutch. If you have not read that yet, I highly recommend you go do that. But it's prompted me to make a video about how the basics of how I write my XPages applications lately. I've taken to switching entirely to Java for all of my programming, and I avoid server JavaScript whenever possible. Not entirely out of hatred for server JavaScript, but more out of, as I'll demonstrate, how I found it improves the structure and cleanliness of my programming. And I've posted about this on my blog before. I call these controller classes, which is a term from the MVC, Model View Controller scheme. It's more or less an accurate term. I haven't come up with a better one, so I'm sticking with that. And to begin with, there are a couple blogs that you may want to check out. As I mentioned, Tim Tripkiny started this. He's had another post recently, and you should definitely check that out. Declan Lynch has started a very promising series on digging into Java for XPages developers. That's over at qtzar.com. You should go follow that. I'm very much looking forward to how that turns out. And then there are my two posts on controller classes that I made. If you go to Frostilicus/controllers1 and controllers2, there's an introductory post when I was first trying out the idea to try to go over what I meant by it, and then there was a follow-up about trying to dig into it a little more now that I've found some major success working this way. Now, why do this? Why not just do XPages the normal way, the way that you'd find in any tutorial where you place a button and you put some server JavaScript there, and that works. But there are a number of reasons. The first is code organization. It doesn't really matter too much if you just have a basic page with one or two actions on it and there's not much going on. But the more code you have, the more complicated your app gets, the easier it can be to create a giant mess for yourself. And it's not just while you're working on it immediately, it's also for yourself later down the road, 6 months down the line, when you have to open it back up and all of a sudden you can't figure out what it's doing. If you start out with a nice clean structure, then that way it's going to be a lot easier to keep it clean as you go on. Obviously you can make any structure a complete mess, but giving yourself a good start is going to help you a lot down the line. Another advantage is cleaner XSP markup. I personally work entirely out of the source pane when I'm dealing with XPages, so I care a lot about how the XML code looks, and having a lot of server JavaScript in there, or really having a lot of anything, can make it a mess. And so moving as much out of there as possible makes it a lot easier when I want to go in and focus on the layout of the page or the CSS styles. I don't want to also have to worry about how I'm storing an employee record in the database. One of the other advantages is that when you switch over to using Java instead of server JavaScript, you have better tools that come with Eclipse. The Eclipse editors that Designer has, the server JavaScript ones are getting a lot better, especially in the social edition beta, but the Java ones are still better, and autocomplete is better, and it's a lot more natural, and they're part of the vanilla platform, and they have a lot of advantages coming from that. And similarly, you get better performance, not just when dealing with Designer, but also just on the server. Compiled Java code is faster than server JavaScript. The reasons have to do with evaluating strings at runtime, but the main thing is that when you write your code in Java, it's going to be faster for the same things. Now, a lot of the time that doesn't matter. If you're just doing one or two operations, the microseconds here and there are not going to make that big of a difference, but it will matter long term, especially once you have very complicated, very processor intensive code. Writing it in a compiled form is going to end up being a lot better for your application. But most importantly of all for me is it's good for your brain. This goes with the code organization, which is that giving yourself a certain amount of structure, setting up some restrictions on yourself, can really make your output a lot cleaner. It can make you think more clearly. In Domino, there are a lot of ways to do everything, and if you pick all of them, you're going to end up with a tangled mess. I mean, everybody's had an application that's just, you've tried several different ways to do it all at once over time, and it just becomes a mess. So if you just say, I'm going to do it this way, this is the way it's done, you're going to end up thinking more clearly, keeping everything straight in your head, and focusing more on the problem at hand rather than fighting the past version of yourself. Now, these controller classes, the specific ones I'm doing, are part of a project called XPages scaffolding that Lotusscript and I started recently. We haven't had that much time to put new code into it, and so it's just up on GitHub. Eventually it'll probably be a open NTF project. But the idea of the XPages scaffolding is that it will be a good basic template for, I want to write a XPages application, maybe a One UI one or a Bootstrap based one, and you just want to start out with some of the basics, some handy tools like controller classes, like Flash Scope, some various other tools that, little bits here and there that aren't necessarily big projects on their own, but are extremely useful as a basis of, here's a new application that I'm starting, but I don't want to start it from basic vanilla NSF. Now, you saw that next button that I went through, and now it has an out of phases thing. This is an extremely contrived example, but I set it up to demonstrate controller classes. So if we go over to Designer and look at the page, you can see that there's no server JavaScript on this page. You have the button here at the end, which was the next button I was clicking, and what it does is it calls a method on the server controller. I call it pagecontroller, and basically what this is it's very similar to, if you're familiar with managed beans or other Java elements, it's basically a Java object that's floating in the background, essentially. And using these expression language bindings, the bracket pagecontroller dot method name, basically that's just saying when this event happens, either up here before page load or down here clicking on the event handler, it calls that Java code instead of having server JavaScript there. I could easily replace that with server JavaScript, but again, that would defeat much of the point of the cleanliness. So you can see that pretty much everything on this page is dedicated towards setting up the structure and look of the page, and not towards the performance of it. What happens when you click that button is that it increments a little counter that moves, and it shows different parts of the page that I was looking at, which is not really, that action of incrementing the counter is not really relevant to the structure of the page. That's more of a code action thing, and so that's where some of the separation of code and page structure and page layout comes in handy, which is that now if you're working with this XSP, you don't really care how that counter is incremented, and I'll demonstrate on another page when that's, counters it's easy, but when it comes to other things it could be a lot more complicated, and so now the XPage doesn't care, and that could be useful either for yourself or if you're working on a team. Some person is responsible for doing the front end and some other person is responsible for doing the back end, and having all of the action code in Java means that that can be separated and you don't have to be stepping on each other's toes either in a source control environment or just having to worry about, oh crap, is this person going to want to modify this in this other way? All you need to know about is I will do these methods, you do this structure, and it's nice and cleanly separated. So you can see here there are a couple divs, and they're just basically just rendered if the counter reaches a certain point. I used expression language here instead of server JavaScript, and expression language is a great little tool. It's basically a nice clean version of a nice clean way to write code for things like testing equality, testing greater than, or binding to methods or properties. If you've seen a binding for like a text field as doc.firstname, that is expression language. That's saying take the document object and try to find the field first name on it. In that case, it knows that the document class implements certain things, so it knows how to get to first name. You can also see that with Java objects where you do doc.whatever or object.whatever and you get some other property. Here I'm using it to compare content phase, which is just going to be an integer, to see if it's greater than or equal to 1. There's this handy little GE, which means greater than or equal to, which is the same as the greater than sign and equal to, but it looks a little cleaner. The reason expression language has those kinds of things is that since it's embedded in HTML or XML all the time, you can't do less than signs and you can't do ampersands without escaping them, and it basically ends up looking ugly. So with expression language you can do things like and true, which obviously you wouldn't do, but you can write that out and it looks cleaner, and you don't have to write ampersand, that's just a drag. So expression language makes that a lot easier. And so it's just a couple greater than or equal to in each phase. And then here at the end I use, this is actually something I found out about only a couple days ago. It's the empty operator in expression language. And basically what this says is it checks to see if something is null or an empty string or an empty array or an empty map. And it's so extremely handy that I had to show that off here, even though it's not really about controller classes specifically. But this is basically saying if there's something in the content error property of viewScope, then show this, and similarly over here, if there's nothing in there, then show the button. So that something and nothing in JavaScript or Java can be a little harder to express, because you'd have to say, does it have this property? If it does, is it null? Is it an empty string? Is it whatever? Empty just kind of handles that. So if you use expression language, I highly recommend trying out the empty operator. It has already improved my life, and it's only been a couple days. But onto the controller, you can see this is calling the more content method. So if you go over here, this is the controller. It's a very basic Java object. It extends a basic abstract class. This will be part of the XPages scaffolding when I come up with some proper documentation explanation of that. But for now, basically, it's a object that has a couple methods that correspond to the things that you saw on the XPage side. And so you can see it has the after page load, and what that does is it just puts the initial phase of 0 into the overall into the viewScope. And then it has this other method, more content, and you saw I had bound pagecontroller.moreContent. All that means is just call pagecontroller.moreContent, and so that takes the viewScope, it gets the total phases, which is a data context up here just for fun, and then it just compares that, it increments it, and otherwise it puts an error. And so that's what you saw there. This is, as I said, extremely contrived, but you can see that this is similar to server JavaScript you might write. It's a little more verbose because it's Java, but but it's the same idea, which is that I want to execute this block of code, and you're just putting it here instead of on the page directly. Now, for a more advanced example, this is actually a post that I made a couple weeks ago about bean-backed tables or something along those lines. The idea being that one of the oldest problems that you'd have when doing Notes applications is that you'd want like a document that has an arbitrary number of rows in a table on it, and sometimes those would be response documents, sometimes those would be hidden rows in a table that goes up to 20, and you just hope nobody ever wants more than 20, that kind of thing. It's a common problem, and everybody doing Notes development has dealt with it one way or another. And I felt that this was a good example for showing off controller classes. You can easily do this just as well in server JavaScript, but it provides a closer to real world example that isn't just clicking the next button a couple times. So here, this is a data table that has a couple columns, plus and minus, and it's basically, this is the first row that's added, and it's a text area and a date field. Nothing special there. You can add additional rows, you can put stuff there. It's the same kind of XPages stuff you've seen. But what matters is the code side. So if you look over, the structure of the XPage is very similar to before, but then you have this data table, and I have a couple columns. Here's the one that shows the text area, and here's the one that shows the date. So those are just the data columns. And here I have the add remove column, and the main points here are that there are two buttons. One is add and one is remove, and all those do is just bind to add row and remove row. So again, this page doesn't really care how that's done. It doesn't care where the data is coming from. All it's doing is saying, all right, call the get table contents method in pagecontroller to get me the value of this. It doesn't matter if that's coming from a view scope. It doesn't matter if it's coming from a database, coming from SQL. Who cares? All the page cares about is that the pagecontroller will provide the contents, and it will provide means of adding and removing the current row. So if you go over to the controller class, you can see here it is just a view scope. I create an object, an array list, and I populate it with a map, which is like, if you're not familiar with them, they're like Lotusscript lists, and they're also actually very similar to documents, where they're just, you have a named property and you give it a value. And so I create a list of those and then put that in the view scope. Like I said, it could easily be in a notes document. I've done it all, stored as a mime bean or as a list of strings, or it could be from some completely different data source. Doesn't matter. The Java code handles that. The XPage doesn't have to care. So I have this method that says get table contents, and all it does is just take that table contents out of the view scope. That means that on the XPage I could have easily done viewScope.tableContents, but again, this means that, that's not the XPage's job. That's the controller class's job. And the add rows, they just get the table contents and then they add a new object. Or what they do is, this is another crucial part, they find out which row you're dealing with on the page and then remove that row from the array. So that's this resolve variable method here, and if you look at the implementation for it, it's just using the xlibutil resolve variable. So there's no real magic there, it's just I wanted to save myself a little typing. So basically what it's doing is saying, alright, when somebody clicks this button, find out what the current value of row index is, which is the index var of my data table, very similar to the way a repeat does it. Find out what that is, and then remove that index from the list, the array list. And so what you're doing, like right here, this is row 0, this is row 1, this is row 2. And so when you click this button, what expression language is doing is saying, alright, find the page controller object, now call remove row, and remove row will say, okay, I need to know what is the value of the index var for this context. So right here, that value is 2. Right here, it's 1. This actually, at a very technical level, is the same exact thing that happens in server JavaScript, but it feels more indirect here. But the important thing to know is that when you resolve a variable with a method called via expression language, it is in the context of wherever that is on the page. So you have access to everything. You'd have your access to, like you can see, view scope and data context and domino documents and all that kind of thing if you use resolve variable. It is Java, so you have to cast back to the object type that it is. But basically the idea is that using this, you can move all of your code from server JavaScript to Java and get all of the benefits of better autocomplete, better integration with other objects, better structure. And you can do all of the same stuff. There's no part where server JavaScript is able to do it and Java absolutely can't. And at a very technical level, that's because server JavaScript is run by Java. And in the same way, you're just doing it a little more directly. And so in these examples, like I was saying, you could easily do it with server JavaScript, but having this kind of exercise may help you try it out and see, like, all right, this is a much cleaner way. I mean, with a small thing like this, it doesn't really matter, but imagine if this had a tab table with 20 tabs and 50 buttons on it, and you were dealing with 5 data sources and trying to wrangle them and all this other stuff, and before long it would get extremely complex, and you'd start being much happier that you'd have very structured code here where you'd say, alright, if I'm looking for code that's happening, like if I want to figure out how it's calculating a certain value, that's going to be on the Java class. If I want to figure out how the table is built and which style classes it has, that's the XPage. It's a nice separation of responsibilities, very similar to the way if you're writing a normal web page, you have HTML to handle the structure, CSS to handle the design, and JavaScript to handle the actions. In this way, that's the XPage, the theme, and the controller class. So it's a very good analogy to the way you do normal web development, and you get a lot of the same benefits. With normal HTML, you could put all of your JavaScript in line, but that would end up being a tangled mess, and I'm sure everybody's done that at some point, and it just doesn't end well. Similarly, the standard way of writing XPages doesn't end well, and I found this to be a much better way of doing it, and it's made my applications a lot cleaner, and I hope to expand on this more in the future. This is still something that I'm building up, and once I have the XPages scaffolding more in place, I'll release that and have some documentation saying, this is basically my new way of doing XPages applications. So this may not be something you want to jump into immediately, but I feel like it's something worth thinking about, and if you are comfortable with Java, it's definitely something that may be worth considering. If you want to ask me about it or find out more, you can always find me at my blog, or you can find me on Twitter as Gidgerby, Gidgerby. You can tweet me there. I'm always glad to talk about this kind of thing, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions anybody has. Thank you.
And that's the demo. I really appreciate Jesse coming on. I would really love to have him back on for more Java tutorials. And if you have any questions for me, here's my information, and I thank you for your time.